In the spring of 2004, a young couple named Andriy and Lina moved into an old house in a village outside Ivano-Frankivsk in western Ukraine. The house had been empty for 11 years. The previous owner, an elderly woman, had died there alone. No relatives had claimed the property. It had simply stood empty, waiting. The first night, Lina woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of spinning. A rhythmic, mechanical sound, wheel turning, thread pulling, the specific cadence of someone working a spinning wheel in the dark. She lay still and listened. Andriy slept beside her without moving. The sound continued for exactly 7 minutes, and then stopped. She told Andriy in the morning. He checked the house. Every room, the cellar, the attic, nothing. No spinning wheel, no evidence of anyone having entered. He said it was the pipes. Old houses made sounds. She nodded and said nothing more. But that night she did not sleep until dawn. The spinning continued every night for 2 weeks. Always at 3, always for 7 minutes. Always stopping so completely that the silence afterward felt louder than the sound. And then the spinning stopped and something else began. She started finding her yarn. She knitted, kept several balls of yarn in a basket by the window, tangled every morning. Not loosely tangled, deliberately, intricately, impossibly tangled, as if someone had spent the night working very hard to make it impossible to unknot. Her neighbor, an old woman who had lived next door for 60 years and remembered the previous owner, came for tea one afternoon and looked at the tangled yarn in the basket and went very still. Then she looked at Lina and said, "Did anyone tell you about this house before you moved in?" Lina said no. The old woman set down her cup and said, "Then I will tell you now. The Kikimora is the most domestic of all Slavic spirits, more domestic even than the domovik, more intimately connected to the interior life of the house and the family within it. Where the domovik was a guardian, a protector, something that watched over the household with benevolent attention, the Kikimora was something different. She was a disruption, a presence that had settled into the walls and the floors and the dark spaces behind the plaster, and that expressed herself through interference, through the unraveling of domestic order, through the targeting of the specific tasks and rhythms that held a household together. Spinning, weaving, the night-time quiet, the sleep of the family. She came from several origins depending on the regional tradition. In some accounts, she was the spirit of a child who had died unbaptized, the same incomplete death that created other restless spirits in the Slavic tradition. In others, she was sent deliberately, placed in a house during its construction by an enemy of the family who bribed a builder to hide a cursed object in the walls. In the oldest traditions, she was something that simply arrived, drawn to houses where grief was present, where a death had happened and been incompletely mourned, where something emotional had been left unfinished in the same way that an improper burial left something spiritual unfinished. She found the wound in the household, and she settled into it. She was rarely seen. She preferred the spaces between things, behind walls, under floorboards, in the gap between the ceiling and the roof. She was heard more than seen, and felt more than heard. Her presence registered as a quality of the air in certain rooms, a heaviness, a sense of being observed from a direction you could not identify. When she was seen, in the brief, partial glimpses that the accounts describe, she appeared as a small woman, thin to the point of transparency, with a long nose and tangled hair, and eyes that caught light from no visible source. She moved quickly, always retreating before she could be fully observed, always at the edge of vision, always gone before you could be certain of what you had seen. Her activities were specific and consistent across all regional traditions. She spun at night, always spinning, always working the wheel in the dark hours when the family slept, producing thread that was always found tangled and unusable in the morning. She braided the hair of sleeping family members, not gently, not playfully, but tightly, painfully, in knots that pulled at the roots and took hours to undo. She sat on the chests of sleeping people. This detail appears in account after account. The sensation of weight on the chest during sleep, difficulty breathing, the particular paralysis of someone being sat upon by something they cannot see and cannot move against. The Kikimora was not trying to suffocate. She was simply present as she was always present in the most intimate spaces of the household's life. She made the children cry. Not through any direct action. She did not touch them, did not appear to them. But children in a house with a Kikimora woke crying from dreams they could not describe, refused to sleep in certain rooms, clung to their parents with a fear they had no words for. Animals were similarly affected. Dogs whimpered at walls, cats stared at corners, chickens stopped laying. In 1889, an ethnography named Pavlo Chabinsky documented 43 accounts of Kikimora from villages across central Ukraine. He noted that in 37 of the 43 cases, the presence had begun following a death in the house, specifically a death that had been followed by incomplete mourning, a grief interrupted, a loss not fully processed, an emotion that had been suppressed rather than expressed. He was careful to note this as a pattern rather than a conclusion. He was a scientist. He did not endorse the supernatural explanation, but he returned to this correlation in his notes several times, clearly troubled by it. 37 out of 43. An incomplete death, an incomplete grief, and then a presence in the walls that unraveled thread and braided sleeping hair and sat on chests in the dark, as if the house itself was processing what the family could not, as if the Kikimora was not a separate entity but an expression of something unfinished, grief given form, loss given weight, the thing you did not mourn made physical and present and impossible to ignore. The old woman next door told Lena about the previous owner, the elderly woman who had died alone in the house after 11 years of living there following her husband's death. She had never spoken of him after he died, never cried publicly, never allowed condolences, never acknowledged the loss in any way that the neighbors could see. She had simply continued quietly and alone in the house they had shared, and something had settled into the house with her grief, something that spun at night because she had no one to spin for anymore, something that tangled thread because the domestic order she maintained so carefully had no one to witness it, something that had been there for 11 years before Lena and Andrea arrived and found it still waiting, still spinning, still working through something that had never been resolved. The protections against the Kikimora were specific. Fern was the primary protective plant, hung in the house, placed near the hearth, tucked into the spaces where walls met floors. The smell of it was considered deeply uncomfortable to her, connected to living green things in a way that a spirit of enclosed spaces could not tolerate. Certain stones, specifically stones with natural holes worn through them by water, were hung near the beds of sleeping family members. These were called hen stones or seeing stones, and the hole through them was considered a window into the spirit world that worked both ways. You could see through it, and things on the other side could be seen. The Kikimora disliked being seen. You spoke the grief aloud. This was the deepest protection, and the hardest one. You named what had been lost. You said it clearly in the house. You did not pretend the loss had not happened. The Kikimora fed on unspoken things. She found the gaps in what was said and settled into them. A household that spoke its grief fully, that mourned completely and openly, gave her nothing to settle into. Lena did something the old woman had not suggested and had not expected. She sat in the center of the house, in the main room, on the floor at 3 in the morning, when the spinning would have begun, and she spoke to it, not commanding it to leave, not performing a ritual, just talking. She talked about the old woman who had lived there, about what it must have been like to lose a husband and continue alone in a house full of his absence, about grief that has nowhere to go, about the spinning wheel that had no practical purpose anymore but kept turning anyway because the hands remembered the motion even when the reason was gone. She never knew if what she had done was correct by any traditional standard. She had not used fern or hold stones or any of the old protections. She had simply spoken the unspoken thing, the grief that had lived in those walls for 11 years, waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. Maybe that was all it had ever needed. Not removal, not ritual, just acknowledgement. Just someone sitting in the dark in a house full of old grief and saying, "I know you are here. I know what you lost. I am sorry no one said this sooner." The house felt different after that. Not empty. Houses that have held long lives never feel empty, but lighter, as if something that had been wound very tightly for a very long time had finally, gently been allowed to unwind. The spinning wheel that had turned in the dark for 11 years had finally, at last, run out of thread.